Okay, my friend, let's talk about record. Now, I need to get something out of my chest. So, over the past few months, I've been talking with some of the practitioners in the industry, some of the contractors, especially subcontractors. I realized one thing. Now, records. Records are important in NEC contracts. Whatever contract that you are using, as long as you are using NEC contract, for example, NEC 4 contract, NEC 3 ECC contracts, then records are important. Why is that so? Now, just as we love the certainty of NEC contract, just as we like that in NEC that all communication has to be in written form, meaning as long as they can be read, copied, and recorded and specified in the scope, then this is communication in NEC, just as we like it, so that no project managers, no clients can eat their words. Everything is on record. You, the contractor and the subcontractor, you need to provide the records accordingly in written form, which can be read, copied, and recorded. It's more than administration. It's more than boring admin works. The fact is, no records, simply put, classically, no payments. It's more than payment, actually. Records are more than about whether you will be paid or not. But let's talk about payment because this is the most classic example here. So that is for today. Let's go for it. Now, when we talk about records, we first of all need to understand that records are crucial in NEC. Why? Because over the whole contract, we see multiple clauses whereby records are the fundamental, I should say, the basic element that a project manager and a contractor can base on when we deal with different issues in the contract. For example, payment. Let's talk about payment. Let's take that as an example. For example, in option A contract, we know that this is a lump sum contract and we use an activity schedule. What is an activity schedule? You, the contractor, or you, the subcontractor, will only be paid for completed activities. Now, this is in the contract, and therefore, you need to show to the project manager that what are the completed activities. That is record. That is record. For example, let's say from high level to low level. High level, the program has to be aligned with your activity schedule. Otherwise, think about this. How can a project manager look at the program and make a decision that a certain activity has been completed? Now, that is from the project manager side. How about from your side? From your side, the contractor side, the subcontractor side, if you have got your program being well recorded, showing what are the completed activities, what are not completed, how many percentage has been completed, and so on and so forth. How about the defects? Have they been corrected or they are still keep in view? In option A, if an activity is not completed, meaning an activity is still ongoing or having some defects which will affect the succeeding activity, then that activity will not be paid. We do not want to have unnecessary dispute, and therefore the records are the objective criteria that a project manager and a contractor can base on when they talk about payment. It's not just option A. Option B, for example. Option B is what? Option B is bill of quantities, remeasurement contract. And let's think about this. If you are using option B contract, remeasurement contract, then we are talking about method of measurement. Then, if you look at your records, are your records comply with the method of measurement? Now, sometimes things are quite straightforward. How many meters of water pipes? How many cubic meters of concrete? Sometimes things are quite straightforward. But how about the time spent? Number of hours? Now, that sort of record may not as easy as we think. Let's think about the timesheets. If those timesheets are not well kept, then if we refer the payment to the bill of quantities, things can happen. You may not be get paid. Simply because under NEC contract, for whatever options that you are using, under clause 50.2, which is talking about the payment procedures, we require the contractor in NEC for ECC to not just show an invoice. It's more than one figure. You need to show the details. You need to show the details when you apply for payment. If there are no details, your submission of payment application is not a submission of payment application per se in NEC 4. It has no effect. So that is clause 50.2. If I read that sentence out, it says something like this. Clause 50.2 on page 15 of the contract, perhaps I should put that on the screen. It says, the contractor's application for payment includes details on how the amount has been assessed. And it says it's in the form stated in the scope. Now, we all understand sometimes the scope may not be that well drafted. It's just saying if there is such a form stated in the scope, then you need to follow that form stated in the scope. If not, at least you the contractor and the subcontractor, should still include the details on how you come up with that assessment of the amount due and apply accordingly. If you haven't submitted the details, then the so-called application of payment to be submitted by the contractor has never been submitted because that is not according to the standard. Then the contract in NEC for ECC will say essentially the project manager will just look at the amount due of this assessment date and the amount due of the last assessment date and choose the less amount. Essentially, most of the time, it simply means the project manager is not going to pay. And therefore we say records. No record, no payment. That is the reason why we say so. Let me give us another example. Now I talked about option A, option B. Even so, records are even more important for option C and D. So what are options C and D? Some people will call them target contracts. Some people will call that pain share, gain share type of contract. Whatever terminology you use, we need to understand in option C and D, you are looking at defined cost. Defined cost. We do have an activity schedule and bill quantities to calculate the total of the prices to come up with the target. And we compare the target with whatever defined cost and fee that both the project manager and contractor have agreed upon. But let's think about the defined cost. Now you have something on top, let's say one level lower. Let's not talk about the program. Let's not talk about that record. Let's talk about the site records, the site diaries, things like that. How about those? We need to understand not all costs are defined costs. Some of the cost may not be a defined cost and they will be in the fee. Then how to differentiate between the two? Well, the schedule of cost components. And therefore your record should be easy to read enough to compare your record or records with the schedule of cost components if you are using options C and D. Otherwise, there will be a hard time to differentiate whether this is a defined cost, whether that is not a defined cost. For example, people. For example, equipment. For example, all the charges like the bills, electricity, water, internet, telephone bills, all these. We need to make sure the record that you have recorded on site is in accordance with the requirement as listed in the contract. For example, in option C, schedule of cost components. And therefore, these days, automation may help quite a bit. And that is the reason why we have different types of IT platforms. Now, if you ask me, I'm a big fan of it. I have no problem with all these computing software. Some people tend to be very negative. I have no problem with them at all. But one thing though is sometimes automation has a limit. We need to understand that even with automation, we need our human brains to process some of the records. Yeah, we cannot totally depend on the computer. Sometimes there may be something missing, some missing records in there. And we need to be very careful of that. And we need to understand what sort of assumptions are behind all these IT platforms. Otherwise, sometimes things will happen. As simple as, I talked with one of the contractors back then. As simple as the clause numbers can be wrong. Why? Because they did not realize, oh my goodness, that software is only used for NEC 3, ECC contract, and now you are tackling an NEC 4 TSC contract now. So you cannot use the same platform. You need to adjust some of the settings in there. You can't just use it just like that. So that is option C and D. Just about payment. We haven't even talked about compensation events. Compensation events is another thing. So let's think about this. Records. It's not just about keeping records. It's about keeping the right record. It's not just about keeping good records. It's about keeping the good record, the right record, in accordance with the contract requirements. Just as you use some records in some sort of format, in other types of contract, those type of records may not be applicable to your contract in NEC. Typically, we do not have preliminaries, for example, in NEC, classically. Of course, you can adjust your contract, adjust your practice to suit. But throughout the contract, you do not see such a term, preliminaries. Typically, we do not say extension of time in NEC. And if you put everything as extension of time, they may not align. Let me give you one more example. For example, disallowed costs. Now, as I say, not all defined costs are not all costs are defined costs. And even worse, some of the costs are disallowed. What are the disallowed costs? Typically speaking, the first one which is so common, are those records which are not justified by contractor's record. Where in the contract says so, under, for example, option C, under option C, it's under 11.2, number 26. It says, disallowed cost is the cost which is not justified by the contractor's accounts and records. And therefore, you need the accounts and records to show to the project manager that, come on, okay, these costs are not disallowed costs. These costs are really the costs justified in this contract. Another item is about the resources, for example, the resources or plant and materials used by the contractor after allowing for what? After allowing for reasonable wastage. Or in another clause, it says after allowed for reasonable availability. How to prove? If you do not have written record like that, then you, the contractor, may be disadvantaged because you cannot show or prove to anyone that, look at this is reasonable. What is reasonable? You need something to prove. You need something concrete, solid to prove, rather than just saying something. So, records, once again, records is important, not just for payment, not just for compensation event. Next time round, maybe I will talk about early warnings. An early warning notification is not the same as a compensation event notification. It's not right to say a notification of an early warning will not have financial impacts. This is so common, this phrase. Now let's talk about that next time. Let's clarify that next time. So records, remember, my friend, I hope this is useful for you. See you next time.